Started. Good morning, everyone.
Oh, AT&T and everything.
Okay. I just said good morning. Senator Gaines, you want to say something?
A couple comments.
Yeah, I will do that, yes. No problem.
There's a couple birthdays today.
We're going to start.
No.
I always like to do that.
Can do whatever you
People
want.
have a little bit of information to start today. Yeah. That's fine.
Well, I would think we do our opening remarks. Gaines has something to say. Hasib? I think I saw Hasib around the corner. No? Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to you. I'm excited to be here. So excited. I lost track of time, so I apologize. But we are going to get started now. It is 10:25, September 28th a.m. Good morning. We're ready to call the Tax Abatement Board Work Group to order and reconvene the State Board of Equalization meeting. Good morning. Mr. Ketty, do you have any announcements today?
No announcements today.
No
It's a Board
announcements.
work group. Mhm.
Okay, all right. Well, could you call the item?
The first item on the agenda is the property tax,
Work group?
yes, I'm sorry. The work group, the greetings and introductory remarks is the first item on the agenda.
All right, that's great. I love it that you're so excited that you lost your words.
I did, I just
Here we are. We're in our third conversation around property tax abatement. I want to thank my staff that has really done the Herculean task in pulling all of this together. Thank you very much to the BOE staff of District 2. So, and on behalf of my esteemed colleagues, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is the third Board of Equalization Property Tax Work Group meeting. Over the last two meetings of the work group, we've received testimony from distinguished leaders, both on the state and local government, representatives from academic as well as public policy research groups, think tanks. We've seen leaders in the struggle to redress historic wrongs that have harmed communities of color through racist tactics like redlining and exclusion from capital, and from developers both in the nonprofit and the for-profit space who have extensive experience in building housing here in the state. We've also heard from leaders in our state and jurisdictions who have implemented property tax abatement programs to grow the numbers of affordable housing units. And again, we're paying particular consideration to the missing middle. And by definition, by missing middle, I'm just using a loose definition of school teachers, first responders, service workers, manufacturing workers. But one thing that we all have in common is a goal of building more housing that's affordable and accessible to the middle class. I want to note that stakeholders in California recognize the urgent need to produce 2.5 million new housing units in California by 2030, with the goal of at least 1 million of these units being affordable. And during the meeting, we have learned just how difficult it's going to be just to gain consensus. And that's exactly what we're going to need in order to produce the 2.5 million housing units. So just to take a moment to step back and just review where we've been. We began this inquiry focusing on the possibility of using property tax abatements with backfills to ensure that no revenue was lost to our schools and to local governments. We have received presentations from many distinguished stakeholders. We are grateful for the presentations that we are going to hear today, and we look forward for more informative presentations that we're going to hear from today. So I want to go very clearly on the record and state that this is an inquiry. No policy decisions will be made, no votes will be taken. We are merely having a discussion. And this is a discussion that is unfolding without preconceived notions or a preconceived agenda or any kind of anticipated conclusions. really, we are curious to hear about, to hear whether or not property tax abatement can be used to incentivize housing. In particular, we're extremely interested in whether property abatements can be used, could be used as a tool to help projects pencil out. Now, that's a popular vernacular term that basically means that we want to invest money and it'd be a good, solid investment of not only our tangible resources, but intangible resources, our human capital. So I wanted to just also highlight that as a result of these hearings that we are conducting, we will prepare a report on what we have learned that will summarize our conclusions from the testimony that was been taken. This report will include public policy perspectives and recommendations for going forward. And I also want to state that we are assuming the responsibility that has been given to us as administrators of an $85 billion property tax system to study all the possible ways that the property tax system can be leveraged to address unmet housing need. And it's important and essential part of this process is to conduct inquiry into, in the open, that's fully transparent and public. And of course, we will make sure that our stakeholders have a seat at the table as we continue to address these complex public policy discussions. So with that, that is the perspective that we continue to hear from our experts today. I am excited by the quality and the depth of the presentations that we have heard and that we will hear. It's my hope that the report will continue to stimulate debate. And with that perspective, I'd like to turn over to my right to my colleague, Mr. Antonio Vasquez. And then following Mr. Vasquez, we'll hear from the Executive Director, Ms. Yvette Stowers, for opening comments before we hear our first presenter. And want to acknowledge Mr. Vasquez, and I think also Mr. Gaines has some opening comments as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so Vasquez, you, and then Stowers.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. And to each speaker who will be joining us today, either in person or remotely, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise as we explore various property tax options for incentivizing the development of affordable housing in our state. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to provide us with your very valuable input with the board and with the viewing public. Your testimony today is critical in helping us to understand how the property tax exemption and possible abatements can be most effectively used and streamlined. As our chair mentioned earlier today, the history, especially here in the state of California, while we've had programs over the years, especially in the early years, as we became a state with F8, for
Ms.
example.
Vasquez, can I interrupt? At this point right now, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. We're trying to solve them, so I would like it so that you're online. So if you don't mind holding on for one quick second, it looks like we're rebooting. Looks like it's gotten it. All righty, it looks like we're back up. I apologize for interrupting. It was an issue with the Teams, we believe. So we're back up again. Thank you.
Once again, good morning. I don't know how much people heard before, but
Yeah.
I'll just briefly just welcome everybody again. And like I said earlier, real quickly, I just want to thank all the speakers that'll be joining us today, either remotely or in person, for sharing your expertise and experience with us today, because this is a very challenging topic that we're going to take on today. And actually, this hearing is one of many that we've had already. And as we're listening to folks, we're getting different groups throughout the state, interest groups, that are obviously very concerned because this could have some financial impact on their stability, whether it's a city, a county, or a state agency, for example, and our school system, which we'll hear from folks in a little bit this morning. But I guess one of the key things as we discuss this, as we're looking and working with possible incentives, both on the abatement side as well as possible tax credits, is to see what makes sense to hopefully expedite and streamline the process. Because the nonprofit world by itself is not going to be able to meet the demand. The demand is just so high. And I think until we get the for-profit world involved, it's not going to happen to the amount of housing that we need in the state of California. And I know many of my colleagues have shared this, and we don't want to obviously give away the store with tax credits, because obviously that has a ripple effect on the other side. But for those that are willing to do true affordable housing, I think we can come up hopefully with some creative ways to make that happen, whether it's a tax credit or just streamlining the process. And like my chair mentioned earlier today, there's been many programs over the years, like FHA programs that were set up specifically to help people of color. But as we see today, even if we look now, as of 2019, black families, only 41% own their homes. And Latinos are not much better. They're like 49%. And we hope with our incentives that we hopefully will create here soon, or at least put out there, could make a dent in that as well. Because it's not only about creating affordable housing, but ownership, I think, is also a key piece in terms of creating economic wealth for our folks of color in the state of California. And with that, let me turn it back to my chair, and we'll continue this hearing.
Okay. All right, I've just been notified that the California Superintendent of Public Instruction is on, and we will, just give us one moment, Mr. Thurman. We've got to hear from Mr. Gaines, my colleague.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to make some comments about at a later point, if I could. But if I can make two comments just about what's happening in the world real quickly. Mm-hmm. And one has to do with Hurricane Ian that's set to hit Florida, landfall within the next few hours. It's a near Category 5 storm in terms of its strength. It's predicted to blast winds up to 195 miles an hour, and it's prompted evacuation orders for 2.5 million Floridians. And it's going to have major impacts in terms of rain, wind, and flooding and power outages. Secondly, I'd like to just give an update on the mosquito fire. It's 85% contained, 77,000 acres burned. It's the largest fire in California this year. 1,300 personnel are still fighting that fire. So thank you for letting me make those comments. And I don't want to take any time away from our school superintendent, Mr. Thurman. Thank you.
Thank you for also sharing the update. We know that the work that we do in terms of property tax assessment and ultimately collection portion of that goes into not only public education, but fighting fires. So that is important and timely.
Right.
Mr. Thurman, we've got one more speaker, Ms. Stowers, who is the Executive Director of the Board of Equalization. She's going to make opening remarks, and then we will turn to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Chair Corrin and honorable members. I would like to first thank the board for their leadership in exploring ways that the property tax system could be utilized to incentivize affordable housing in California. This work group of property tax abatement provides a valuable forum for public discussion with taxpayers, stakeholders, and state local officials on this complex issue. This is a great opportunity for anyone to provide input and propose possible solutions and other ways we can work together to spur affordable housing. would like to kind of share a personal note that I've just kind of, when we talk about affordable housing. It's a complex issue. And I'd like to share that here's what I'm dealing with one of my neighbors who had to relocate and decided to put their house up for sale. Nice house, 5-bedroom, 3-bath, motivated seller. Put it on the market for below market rate of $600,000. Open house, bidding war, house sold 2 days, cash offer, $750,000. Escrow closed the next day, house for rent, $4,000. 3 times the rent, $12,000 you have to earn. Not really affordable. That's my personal take. But going back, as BOE co-administers the welfare exemption, we have a critical role in how we can elevate the housing crisis. Finally, I also like to thank esteemed group of presenters for taking time out of their busy schedule to participate today. The last 2 meetings of this work group have provided a wealth of information, and I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you, members.
Of course. Thank you for that sobering reality. Our conversation is very timely. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the microphone our California Superintendent of Public Instruction, Mr. Tony Thurman. He is joining us via the Teams environment, and due to weather, his plane was delayed. So thank you for making every effort to be here. The floor is yours. Good morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to members of Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the members of the Board of Equalization. Thank you for the opportunity to speak remotely. Regrettably, was not able to join you in person due to issues with weather-related travel. BOE member Gaines referenced it, and our hearts go out to those who were impacted directly, as well as those who were impacted by fire in California. We are continuing to support families in California who've been impacted by fires, especially in our school communities. And we know that while the federal and state proclamations for emergency get underway, many of those families need help. And one of the places where they've needed help is in housing assistance, food, water. And so we've been providing support to our school communities in that way. Madam Chair and members of the Board of Equalization, I want to thank you for taking up the issue of affordable housing. As you can imagine, it has been a big part of the equation for our efforts to retain school staff and recruit school staff. Teachers and classified staff and administrators, like everyone else, are impacted in a way where we are just losing folks. And I appreciate your willingness to take up the issue of increasing revenue for affordable housing, in particular for our school-based employees. I would say at the outset that seeing the level of retirements that we're seeing and projected retirements of teachers and others, that this is a critical issue. I would share with you, as I'm sure you know, that there are many who feel fatigued from the effects of the pandemic. And at the same time, as you heard from your executive director, the demand for housing has reached such a level that most Californians are simply being priced out of the ability to live the American dream. It's something that, my grandparents who came here as immigrants and my grandparents on my other side who were former slaves, lived to be able to own a home. And that reality has slipped away for most Californians. And so we appreciate you taking up this issue. I think you know that in my time in the legislature, I worked on a number of affordable housing related efforts, including establishing junior accessory dwelling units that would make the requirements for creating these units less restrictive, less requirements around parking, around permitting, and making it easier for someone who may have an extra room in their home, who can create a unit to be available for someone who might be a senior or might be a teacher or classified staff member. But even so, we continue to see challenges. Even though the legislature has put billions of dollars into affordable housing programs, we just are finding that there are not enough resources to help, and in particular, our educators. I would just say this, that I think we have to get to a place where our school districts are able to first and foremost provide greater salary for teachers and classified staff. And that is the most important thing that we can do to make it possible to provide housing as a reality for educators and for the missing middle that often is not able to be supported by various state programs. Aside from that, I do think that there are things that can be done to support our missing middle. Our teachers, our first responders, and others who work in communities where they'd like to live in those same communities. And we get the benefit of having teachers and classified staff and administrators living in the communities where they serve. Tremendous benefit for our students. Thank you for taking up the property tax work group and for making this a priority policy discussion about ways that we may be able to use tax-related resources to support affordable housing. I look forward to the conversations that you will have about any tax abatement that could take place. And I think it's worthy for discussion about the possibility of a tax abatement program. I would offer just one caution. And that caution, if there's going to be any property tax abatement, means less money for schools at the local level. And that it would come at a time where schools are preparing for there to be a downturn in the economy and less revenue. There have already been projections about less revenue coming forward. And I would ask you just to consider that right now, school leaders are still struggling to make their ends meet and to balance their budgets. And that there is a concern that any property tax abatement would mean less money for local schools over a course of many years that would not be replaced. And so I would just ask you to consider the impacts that such action could have, and ask you that with your committee that you consider the full range of options that can be helpful to creating revenue for affordable housing for school staff. For example, tax credits. And I would point to a program in 2019 that our office worked on with the governor's office to generate more tax credits for building affordable housing. In 2019, the proposal that we worked on led to more than $500 million in tax credits that were available, and a set aside of $200 million worth of tax credits that can go to middle income Californians who wouldn't apply for the traditional low income tax credit programs. These tax credits were made available for developers to essentially sell to investors to generate revenue for building affordable housing, and to work in conjunction with school districts that can make land available. In many cases, districts were able to make surplus property available, not for sale, but maybe through a long-term lease in partnership. And so the combination of these efforts, the tax credits, working with school districts that had surplus property to make available, had created opportunities to build more affordable housing. Multiple units, and this is not, what people might think. It's not like saying, oh, you're a teacher and your principal or your superintendent is going to be the person who holds your mortgage. A completely separate arrangement between the developers, the tax credit, and the tax credit program that was monitored and administered by Cal HFA. And so that there were guarantees that these tax credits would be put to good use to support programs for our educators. And so we hope to see more efforts like these focus on building affordable housing for our educators. Clearly, the state needs to revisit programs that it has for down payment assistance. As your executive director described, the kind of competitive market that exists right now for housing, where people are buying houses in cash, makes it difficult for many of our working Californians to be able to even bid on a house. And so I would submit to you that we would be happy to work with the Board of Equalization on strategies to generate revenue for affordable housing, on any new bills that might get sponsored in the next legislative session by the BOE. We'd be happy to jointly sponsor bills that will prioritize creating affordable housing for teachers and classified staff and administrators and others who work in our school environment. I would only offer the caution that any tax abatement could have devastating effects on the local revenue sources for school districts, and ask that the committee look broadly for opportunities to generate revenue, like the tax credit program or other programs that we could get behind without any unintended and negative consequence to our local schools as it relates to their ability to have financing. I'll stop there, Madam Chair, and submit to any questions that you or the members of the board may have for me. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question. Perhaps you have some advice or guidance you can give us as we begin to navigate. The waters are starting to get choppy, if you will, when we talk about tax abatements, and there is a lot of consternation around backfill and the need to backfill these potential loss of revenue, particularly how it will impact public education. I wanted to hear some of your thoughts around this topic, if you had any.
Well, I think backfill is a strategy that could work if there was a guarantee that you could have the revenue available to backfill. But without that type of a guarantee, it seems as though it is simply a risk, and a risk that could be borne by schools and ultimately the students that we all want to serve. And so if the projections are true, that we're already getting that revenue as soon as this year will be lower, it would seem that a backfill strategy would be hindered with no guarantee to provide that revenue. And on top of the fact that projections are lower, what I worry about is when the economic downturn happens again. And you all know better than me, the way we fund education in our state leaves us to be subject to volatile conditions. I'm grateful that these last few years, California has had the revenue to expand programs for things like universal preschool for every 4-year-old and universal meals for every hungry student, and to expand our after-school programs to support students who need additional supports to overcome learning loss and to accelerate learning and to address learning recovery. But as soon as the economy takes a dip, we are at risk for seeing less revenue for our schools. And even with all the support that the state budget and the federal relief package has provided to our schools, there are so many schools that are still looking at structural deficits. When these dollars go away, they're going to be back to making hard decisions about closing schools and potentially laying off staff. And for those reasons, I would say that the idea of a backfill strategy needs to be evaluated and recognize that there is a fair amount of risk that in short order and in just a few years, we might find ourselves without the revenue to actually backfill.
Well said. Well said. Thank you very much. My colleague, Mr. Vasquez, has a question for you.
Good morning, Tocayo. Just real quick, as I'm looking at, I think you hit on a very good point. And as a former teacher, I'm real sensitive to obviously making sure that we have adequate funding for our schools. So my strategy, at least at the beginning, I think, what I was going to recommend to our group here as we move forward is to maybe target properties that are currently not paying taxes. For example, there's a lot of cities and school districts, like even in Santa Monica, that we have properties that are maybe underutilized or are vacant, which are not paying property taxes now because they're exempt, because they're used for, in this case, for schools. And I was wondering if there's any, on your end, looking at the state, if there's any kind of a list or an inventory of properties at school districts throughout the state of California that are either not being used currently as schools, for example, or maybe as schools that have been closed that are just maybe need to be repurposed, that we can look at, since they're not on the tax rolls now, that wouldn't create an impact, but yet they could be used at least to start the program in terms of developing workforce housing or true affordable housing in the state of California?
Thank you for the question. At the moment, we do not have a list, an inventory, a statewide inventory of parcels that are vacant at school districts, but we would be happy to work with our school district leaders to have them identify parcels that they have that they might be able to designate as priority for consideration for building affordable housing. There are a number of districts that have pursued this work. In San Mateo County and in other parts of the state, there are wonderful examples of where the school district has built housing. And I should say, for our K-12 through higher education partners, in many cases, the recipients are both in the pre-K through 12 space, as well as in community colleges and four-year college space. There are many examples of where this has been done. I think, as you all are pointing out, we need the revenue. But there are examples, and we would be happy to convene a number of partners, school districts, certainly through the Association of Administrators and our partners, our Teachers Association, our Classified School Employees Association. I know they're all interested in this issue, and we'd love to pull them all together to help identify parcels, but it would have to be done on a district-by-district basis at this point.
I had a question.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Looking forward to working with you on this.
Likewise, thank you, sir.
All right, Mr. Schaefer?
Thank you. Superintendent Thurman, Mike Schaefer, nice to see you again.
Morning.
I used to have a clock hour, $12 teaching license a long time ago, $12 an hour. I remember the Field Act came in and prohibited any of our education facilities being more than one story. Was that it? And has there been any change in that? Do they have any multiple story facilities being built within California today and subterranean? I'm just wondering if that would be an issue that would relate to the amount of space we have available for classrooms.
There's no question that many of our districts still struggle as it relates to space, but our schools are going through major conversations right now about how to offset declining enrollment. Our schools are trying to make decisions about the number of schools they should have for their population. There are all kinds of conversations taking place right now about how to reinvent what we do, how to re-envision and reimagine what we do, how we deliver education to a very diverse population and a changing population. California has lost students. We believe that many of those students have gone on to other states. In some cases, maybe homeschool, in some cases, maybe in private school. But the reality is that California has been seeing a decline in population for decades. And that decline has been exacerbated during the pandemic. And it puts California in a position where we have to reimagine everything we do. As a matter of fact, tonight we're hosting a statewide town hall with parents to ask about, what are your concerns about school? If you left California schools, why? We're going to reach out. We're going to do outreach to 1 million homes in our state to say we want to hear from our California school parents. What are your concerns about education? How can our system best accommodate the needs of you and your students and your families? And so in the midst of all these conversations about improving housing availability, we're also working as a system to say, what more can we do? What courses can we offer? This past year, our office sponsored a bill to expand dual language immersion programs, because we know that many of our families want the ability for their child to learn another language, to have access to dual language immersion instruction. And so we're working on ways to offset declining enrollment. And I think that's part of the conversation that schools have about the use of space, about managing classrooms, and how do we project for the future. We can get you the guidelines about what schools are allowed to build. There are new guidelines being put out by many groups, including the state architect and others. We can get you that information sent to your office, Mr. Schaefer, so you have access to what the latest standards are for school construction. I would also just mention, while we're on that subject, this last year's state budget provide some $8 billion for school construction and maintenance to help our schools address a number of their issues. And so we're happy to get you any information you want about the standards for school construction going forward.
Yes, this is Hispanic Heritage Month, as you know, and San Diego is the fastest growing Hispanic part of our state, except in the educational field, the Hispanics are not succeeding as much as would be expected, and I'd like to see, more opportunities education-wise and more motivation for the Hispanic community. Now that it's Hispanic Heritage Month, we can address that.
Well, I would just say that we certainly have our challenges to close the opportunity gap. Some call it the achievement gap. I call it the opportunity gap because I believe that our students can achieve, but they face many barriers like poverty and social economic challenges and institutional racism. And for decades, literally decades, this country has been talking about how to close that gap. And I believe that we can. I think if we do things like recruit and support more educators of color, if we offer more support around literacy for our students, if we continue to address the crises that our students have experienced during the pandemic. Right now, our office has worked with the governor's office to secure funding to be able to recruit 10,000 more counselors to work in our schools so that we can help our students. We have a community schools initiative that will help students all across the state get help with mental health, social services. If you're hungry, we have a universal meals program. We have the resources to re-envision California schools and to overcome the many challenges that we face. And I believe that Latino students and African American students and low-income students from all backgrounds will achieve, but we have to be vigilant in our work. And I would say there are examples of where places where our students are excelling, including Latino students, and great examples in San Diego County. For example, San Diego Unified has had tremendous growth in a number of areas. And I believe that you would be impressed to see great examples at San Diego Unified and districts all across the state. And so we're proud of our students. As we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, we think that Latino students are on the move. We think that we're going to do great things for Black students and for low-income students of all backgrounds. But we have to be vigilant. We have to be willing to have tough conversations. We're administering a grant on anti-bias education as we speak in our schools. We have to have courageous conversations about addressing bias where it exists. We have to have courageous conversations about diversifying our workforce. We have to acknowledge that many of our students live in communities that have high degrees of segregation, high degrees of poverty, and other socioeconomic challenges that have been barriers to their success, but we won't allow them to prevent our students from
Thank
succeeding.
you very much. I want to
Thank you.
pivot us back to the topic at hand. Those are fantastic accomplishments you and your team are doing for the students across the state of California, but particularly the Latino students in San Diego. We appreciate that. I think we are just about out of time, and wanted to see if there's, Mr. Gaines has one question, and then we will let you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you again, Superintendent Thurman, for your comments. And I recall when we were in the legislature that there was an actual statute that I supported that passed that provided the opening up of those excess lands on school sites or school district-owned properties. And so it's nice to hear that there's been some progress made there, and I'm hopeful that that will continue in the future. Do you think that there is hope for regulatory reform? I'm speaking specifically of CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, which has been very difficult to work around in terms of trying to produce additional housing units in California. And I'm just hoping that we can get people around the table from various interest groups and be able to arrive at some sort of kind of logical compromise that just makes it less expensive to build housing in California.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines, and I'll keep it brief. The chair has asked me to keep it focused, housing. I would just say that there have been many bills tried by our former colleagues in the legislature to figure out ways to streamline many parts of the process, not just CEQA, but permitting at the local level, and to get cities to make a commitment to enhancing the number of affordable housing units that they are committed to. I would just say that it's going to take a conversation about every aspect related to housing for us to get there. These are daunting challenges, and everything has to be on the table for conversation. It may not be that everyone will agree, but I think we have to look at every aspect of how we will provide more for Californians. This is something that every Californian should have, and it's slipping away quickly, and it will require creativity, openness, and innovation. And we at the California Department of Education are happy to be at the table of conversation about solutions. We want to be focused on solutions in a way that we can do no harm. We don't want to hurt schools in the process, and so that's why I made the cautions that I did earlier. But again, I applaud the Board of Equalization for being willing to create this work group and taking up your leadership on the conversation of can taxation play a part in the equation of building more affordable housing. Mr. Gaines will stand by and be happy to be a part of those conversations about CEQA or permitting or anything else. And just know that you can count on us to be a part of this effort going forward to build more affordable housing for our educators who, like most Californians, like all Californians, greatly deserve that opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. It's a great note to put a final point on. We don't want to hurt schools. Thank you. I appreciate your contributions today. All right, next, I'd like to pivot back to our clerk of the board.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to do some housekeeping. We will announce the item that Mr. Thurman was speaking. Item 3 on today's board work group agenda is the financial impact of implementing property tax abatements, exploring the backfill options for local governments and schools. We have quite a few different groups that are coming up. Mr. Thurman was part of the first one. We have Brian Euler, Deputy Legislative Analyst, California Legislative Analyst Office. Please come forward.
Thank you very much
As
for
our
joining
next
us
speaker.
today. So you heard a little bit of the remarks. You heard from our Superintendent of Public Instruction, Mr. Euler. We're grateful that you're here to join us this morning.
Yes, thank you for having me. We appreciate you inviting our office to come and be part of this conversation. And I just wanted to kind of open my comments by saying we're here to offer some neutral thoughts on this concept, and just want to be clear that nothing in our testimony today should be taken as necessarily as an endorsement of any of the concepts being discussed. So just kind of want to get that out of the way.
We appreciate the disclaimer.
My comments are going to kind of be grouped in two pieces. The first would be some key features that we think if the state were going to explore creating a new program to provide some backfill funding to cover any property tax losses for local governments and schools, some key features that we'd suggest that program include. And then the second part of my comments would just be kind of stepping back and thinking about this from a kind of big picture state policy perspective. Just some comments on potential challenges or issues for you to consider as you move forward in your process. So first, thinking about some key features that we would suggest including in a backfill program. And this is based on looking at a couple of things. The first is looking at some common characteristics in the state's existing programs for funding affordable housing. The second is looking similarly at common characteristics in other kinds of state tax expenditure programs that are aimed at encouraging certain types of economic activity. So looking at those other examples, what are some things we think should be included here? The first is having some sort of aggregate cap on the amount of property tax abatement that would be available to developers in any given year. So this would be instead of the property tax abatement being available essentially as an entitlement, that you kind of check the box, you say you meet the requirements, you get the property tax abatement. Instead, there would be a process to competitively award the abatement to developers based on the extent to which their projects are meeting state goals on housing affordability or other policy goals. And this model, there's a few reasons for this, and that it's the reason why we see this model being used by the low-income housing tax credit program, by the grant and loan programs that are administered by HCD for affordable housing, and by other kinds of tax expenditures, be the California Competes tax credit or the film tax credit. They all follow this similar kind of model, and there's a few reasons. One is that by creating kind of an aggregate cap, saying, for example, the state will only provide backfill for $200 million of abatements in a given year, that provides a fiscal certainty for the state that makes the budgeting easier if it's set up as an entitlement. That makes it a lot more unpredictable for the state from year to year to be sure that they'll have the money to provide the backfills to local governments and schools. The second piece is with any tax expenditure, including this one, you have the risk that the tax benefit could be provided to a taxpayer carrying out an activity they would have done anyway, regardless of receiving the tax benefit. In other words, receiving kind of a windfall benefit from the tax abatement. That's a risk here. It's a risk with any tax expenditure program. And so one of the potential benefits of having a more competitively awarded process is that you can ask the developers to demonstrate that their project would not have moved forward but for receiving this additional financial assistance. The third component that we would suggest including would be creating an administrative structure for compliance and performance monitoring. Now, there are efforts at the state and local level existing with the low-income housing tax credit or with the welfare exemption at the local level to do compliance monitoring for affordable housing, but neither of those would necessarily overlap with the target population that you all are looking at with workforce housing. And so you would need to think about creating an administrative apparatus that would be able to not just on the front end check that projects are complying with what's necessary to get the abatement, but that the developers are meeting their obligation over time to keep those affordability limits in place. The final piece would be to suggest that the state backfill be provided in a sense on the front end of the property tax allocation system. And so basically what I mean is that the state would essentially enter into an agreement with the developer to pay their property taxes on behalf of the developer. And this would be kind of maybe following a model from the state controller's office for the property tax postponement program, where the state enters an agreement to allow seniors to defer their property taxes, makes the payment on their behalf. It would kind of follow a similar model there. The state would, on the front end, pay the property taxes. So there's a few benefits to this. One is that it limits the fiscal impact for local governments and schools. If the state just makes the payment into the system, that dollar could be treated like any other property tax dollar. From the local government's perspective, they wouldn't see a difference. The revenues would flow through to them in the same way. The challenge with the alternative, say, of you create the abatement, there's a revenue loss, we account for it on the back end, each city and school and county comes to the state and says, I lost $5 million last year. There's a few challenges with that. One was alluded to by the superintendent, which was the locals, I think, would be probably, and I won't necessarily speak for them because I know you have them on a later panel, but I suspect they would be somewhat uneasy with this kind of an arrangement because you're a little bit at the whim of the state to continue providing that backfill, and it would necessarily be on a lag because it would take a couple of years to do that accounting, and the state would then, make that payment in arrears. The counties and cities and schools would be, in some sense, reliant on the state to keep good on that payment, whereas if the state made the payment up front when the abatement occurred, they don't have as much of that risk. The other benefit of doing it up front is that you're avoiding adding additional complexities to an already pretty complicated property tax allocation system. So those are some of the key features. So then just pivoting quickly to some high-level points on thinking about this just from a broader state policy perspective in terms of, effective and efficient, state administration. you know, in some sense, if the state were to provide a backfill for a property tax abatement program like this, it would be, in essence, the state allocating additional resources towards affordable housing efforts. And the state already does make several allocations for affordable housing through HCD, through Cal HFAs, through several avenues. And so kind of a big picture question for you all to consider is what advantage, what unique benefit is being provided by creating this new additional property tax abatement program as opposed to, say, putting additional money or broadening the scope of some of those existing tools that we have. Again, the superintendent mentioned a few years ago how we broadened the scope of the low-income housing tax credit to try to build housing for those at higher income levels. You know, that could be an alternative here. So something to consider is what is the unique benefit as opposed to leveraging those existing institutions that you would get by doing something like the property tax abatement. Relatedly, you know, that kind of raises a similar question of what is the benefit of tying the financial assistance to developers to some amount of property taxes owed, as opposed to, if we compare it to the model we use for the low-income housing tax credit or HCD's housing financing programs, which the payment is more tied to a particular amount of development costs or some financing gap that the developer has. The property tax, I think, has maybe less of a nexus to the amount that the developer is going to need to get that project over the line, as opposed to if we just ask them, how much money do you need to get the project over the line? You know, I think there have been some references to, there are other states like New York with the 421A program that do tie this kind of assistance to an amount of property taxes. In that case, there's an argument for that doesn't necessarily apply as much in California, and that is with New York's property tax system, rental housing ends up paying a higher effective property tax rate than for sale condos. And so this can create a financial disincentive for builders to do rental housing projects. And so part of the motivation behind the 421A program is to kind of level that playing field between rental housing and condos. And that justification doesn't exist as much in California because we don't have that kind of disparate treatment of those properties. So with that, I'll stop there and take any questions that you all might have.
Stop. Actually, thank you very much for being here. So I appreciate this because I just wanted to I guess, kind of put this in perspective. The speaker that we heard from, Tony Thurman, and then Brian Euler, who is the deputy legislative analyst, they are speakers giving the government perspective. And so this perspective is absolutely critical. And like you said in your presentation, there are some models that kind of exist out there. So we could be moving down a very interesting path. Really, my question is why hasn't anyone thought of this before? Why hasn't this ever been explored before, or has it? And if it has, what were the results?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. It's one I wish I had an answer to. I don't know if this is something that's been looked at before.
Do you know where we could find that answer? We need to probably find some retirees to kind of that have that institutional knowledge.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'll think about that, and maybe I can circle back with your staff about it. Yeah.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you. Let me see, colleagues, Mr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Euler, for your presentation. I always look for LAO to give us this very objective analysis here, and I've read your article on the revenue that was published in September 14th. You know, the big three revenue outlook piece. And it discusses the outlook on the major taxes, personal income, sales, corporation taxes, and most likely than not to fall below the projected revenue assumptions of $210 billion. In other words, there is a 70% chance that the revenue from these sources will be below projections. I know you probably do not do such a deep dive or even consider this, but based on your assumptions on the three revenue sources, how will the changes in the economy affect property tax revenue, and how will the abatements affect property tax revenue?
Yeah, so I think I can speak a little more to the first part of that question than the second. So just stepping back, one thing that we've been commenting to the legislature about since the spring, and I think it's reflected in that blog post you mentioned, is that we've been warning that there's a heightened risk of an economic downturn in the near future, and that the state needs to be sort of cautious about what that might mean for state revenues. And this was based on kind of looking at kind of a number of, you might say, leading economic indicators, and that suggests that, there could be some weakness on the horizon for the state revenues. That analysis that we did looking at state revenues, I think similarly applies to property taxes, although there are some factors that mitigate that. With California's acquisition value system, the property tax is much less volatile than any of those three state resources that you mentioned. I'm sure you all are aware of this. So we do think that there is some potential risk that applies to property tax as well. But the downside is probably not as much as with the state's revenues, and it's likely to come on more of a lag. Whereas the state is already starting to see the cash come in weak for like the income tax. Any effects on property taxes of, for example, the weakness we're starting to see in the housing market could take a couple of years to show up. On the abatements, I think it just kind of depends on the details, and so that isn't something that we've really looked at for me to speak to.
But now that you brought this up on the abatement side, from your experience and the analysis you've done, have you ever looked at what may be more effective, abatements versus tax credits?
So that's not something our office has looked at specifically, but I can say this, that it's not a perfect parallel, but there was a proposal a few years ago to create a state opportunity zone tax benefit to, among other goals, incentivize housing development. And one of the comments that we made at that time about opportunity zones was that affordable housing financing is already pretty complicated. I think you all had some developers in here at your last hearing who told you about how they have to put together 7 different streams of funding in order to make the projects pencil together. So one of the big disadvantages of, say, doing an additional piece into that puzzle for them with the property tax abatements is that it's just adding additional complexity to that system, whereas, the alternative might be just pursuing, leveraging that existing state low-income housing tax credit, for example, one that the developers are already familiar with. It's already part of their financing structure. So that is an important consideration. Is, as I said before, it's not necessarily a deal breaker that adding that complexity, but you want to be sure that you're getting some sort of unique benefit from this property tax piece as opposed to just leveraging what you have.
And you just touched on another issue. I know that we heard from other folks in our previous hearings that the state needs to do a better job of streamlining it, maybe creating some kind of a one-stop shop. Have you ever looked at, some of the maybe there's some duplication, and I don't know if it's at the state level or through some of these commissions, and in hearing from at least the developers on the housing side saying, many, especially the nonprofits, they can't afford to sit back and wait 2 or 3 years to put the finances together. And if we were to have like a one-stop shop that would streamline this thing, it would make it so much easier for them to generate more housing.
Yeah, I don't think I can speak too much to that one. I've only it's been a few years since I worked on housing policy stuff. I've kind of migrated over to doing the tax and economic stuff now. So I don't want to speak based on some old knowledge, but I do know. I think in general the state has tried to be mindful in past budget allocations about. Generally putting funding into the existing state programs, trying not to add additional fragmentation. But yeah, there certainly are a number of programs spread across a number of state agencies, federal agencies. So yeah, it certainly makes sense that the developers would have that perspective.
Thank you.
Nope. Yes, Mr. Gaines? Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for all your great information. And I'm just trying to look at this a little bit from a more broader standpoint in terms of declining population that, from what I've read, we've had in the last 2 years. And what is the adverse effect from a tax perspective? Because, we hear about a lot of these high-profile people or companies that move out of the state. If we're potentially entering into a recession, we talk about abatement for housing. Are we looking at any abatement to keep Californians in California so that they're not taking the tax base with them?
Yeah, so I think there are some existing state efforts along those lines. One of the things I mentioned earlier in my comments was the California Competes tax credit program, and I think one of the motivations of that program is that they work with businesses who are saying California's getting too expensive, we're going to go to Texas or whatever, and they try to put together a package of tax incentives to keep those businesses here. So there are some efforts like that at the state level. As far as the general question of the effect of migration on tax revenues, there certainly has been a lot of commentary about especially out-migration during the pandemic, and even before that, there was kind of an accelerating trend of people leaving the state. And that's definitely true, and it appears to have intensified during the pandemic. That being said, we're still kind of talking about it most affecting 1% or less of the state's tax base in terms of all of that, all of those migration flows. So it's certainly an important issue, but it's maybe not among the top factors in terms of magnitude of things that are going to be affecting the state budget situation over the next few years. Probably much more important is just the broader kind of economic uncertainty that we're facing.
Okay. We've certainly been able to create wealth through companies going public and creating a lot of millionaires, and they're paying high taxes, and we've got that huge surplus. We've had surpluses for the last few years, and so I worry about sustainability and being able to maintain that, because that's been a huge benefit to Californians in terms of that extra revenue flowing in. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Gaines.
Thank you.
Good points. Mr. Euler, you have been spot on today with your comments. I appreciate that. I'm glad they're on the record. We probably will be connecting back with you. I am curious to know what historically the state has done, if anything at all. So thank you for making your time to be with us today. Ms. Cicchetti, could you call the next group of speakers?
The next group of speakers regarding private sector perspective. Honorable Michael Ruse, former Speaker Pro Tem, the California State Assembly, and Eric McKean, Managing Director of Ramirez & Co.
Thank you
Mr.
very
McKean will come forward, and then Mr. Ruse is virtual.
All right, great. Thank you very much. We are very much a modern body. So we've got Mr. McKean, Eric McKean in person, and we've got the Honorable Mike Ruse online. So I am going to invite the Mr. Speaker to speak first. Mr. McKean, we'll hear from you second. Mr. Ruse, how are you? Welcome. Good morning.
I'm fine, and good morning to you, Madam Chair and members. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I wish I could have accepted the personal invitation. In fact, being introduced as virtual is the nicest compliment I've received all week. So it is terrific to be with you. It's hard for me to believe that it's now 40 years since the Mello-Roos Community Facilities Act was adopted and signed into law by Governor Brown the first term, and actually his second term. And at the time, I must tell you that for many of us, we felt it was going to be a bridge piece of legislation to go somewhere else. It was designed to solve an immediate problem of infrastructure development in the state caused by Prop 13 and the insistence that any additional infrastructure was basically a tax that should be voted on. We found a solution, and here we are 40 years later with it being a robust tool used in California to develop infrastructure and hopefully affordable housing up and down this state. And it's my pleasure and my reason for being here, not only out of respect for this wonderful body that I did a lot of work with in my 14 years with the California State Assembly, but it's my honor to introduce a colleague of mine at Ramirez and Company, Eric McKean, a senior vice president who's been an investment banker in the public space for 15 years. Eric is a graduate of Stanford University and a person who understands the implementation of Mello-Roos like no other banker that I have been associated with over the years. He's done essentially $7 billion in public financing in his career thus far, $2 billion of which has led to public infrastructure development for active projects that have been completed with people living now in those houses supported by that infrastructure. He lives in the Bay Area. He has a new 10-month-old child, his first. Welcome to parenthood, Eric. And is a member of the Municipal Management Association in Northern California, along with the BIA. The Municipal Management Association gets my attention because it is a nonprofit that is designed to help people achieve their dream of becoming city managers of our cities up and down this state. So without any further ado, Madam Chair and members, I introduce you to my colleague, a very talented banker, Eric McKean.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. McKean. Good to see you in person.
Good to see you. Good morning, Madam Chair and board members, and thank you for having me, and thank you for involving Ramirez and Company. Ramirez is a public finance firm, and so we specialize in raising money for public infrastructure, and in particular, housing, and we do that through the CFD Mello-Roos tool that Mike just described. In speaking with Madam Chair's staff, we thought it'd be beneficial to talk about that tool because there's a lot of merits to the policy that could be relevant to this discussion, and even potentially some solutions there for this backfill option. So we have a presentation that I'll go through very quickly because I know time is short. So if you could please pull up the presentation and turn to slide 1, that would be great. So we're going to start really with the basics of what is a CFD. So a CFD is a specific area where we can levy a special tax. As Mike mentioned, this policy was enacted as a way to create a mechanism to raise money for public infrastructure. It's been wildly successful. There have been thousands of CFDs formed, many billions of dollars raised for this important infrastructure that allows housing development to occur throughout the state. What's unique about it is that the special tax is really flexible in how it's designed and created. The only thing you can't do is have it be an ad valorem tax because of Prop 13. It goes on for a very long period of time, so that's why we're able to sell 30-year bonds that are secured by these special taxes. Next slide, please. So why has Mello-Roos been so successful? So first, we needed money for public infrastructure. So as Mr. Roos mentioned, this was a tool desperately needed by local agencies and developers because public infrastructure is very expensive everywhere in the country, not just in California. So that was the primary reason and why it's been successful. But also local agencies have really jumped on this tool because they were able to bond against it and raise a lot of money up front versus doing small projects on a pay-go basis. The third reason, the developer community was really behind this policy and are today. They viewed it as a public-private partnership where they get this very low-cost financing relative to their other capital sources, and they're able to use this debt as essentially off-balance sheet financing to help them with their projects. Next slide, please. The other part that's really key here, and this was mentioned on one of your prior meetings on the JPA topic, what's really powerful about this tool is that we raise money through the municipal bond market, and it's tax exempt. So the cost of funds is very low, and that's why we're able to be very competitive with the cost of funds. Just skipping to the bottom, the other part that has been very successful is that there are really established processes that provide a lot of disclosure to home buyers on what this tax is and what the annual costs will be. And we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So here's the list of what can be financed through the CFD Mello-Roos law. This is not an extensive list, but it's a sample. I won't go through each one, but it's all the public infrastructure that you'd think of for a new housing development or a new commercial development. You can also pay for services like extra police and fire through a CFD. I think the thing to point out here is that all of these services are of public benefit. If there ever is a private use element to what's financed, then the bonds that we sell become taxable. So there can be a private benefit to a CFD, but it does flip the economics on the cost of funds for this program. Next slide, please. So one of the really beneficial parts of this policy tool is that you have to have local goals and policies that dictate how a CFD works and how the special tax is levied. So it provides really good guidelines for each local agencies. Again, this is a policy that has to be adopted. It creates the process with developers to be very streamlined. And it just, it's great to have, sound policies. Next slide, please. So each CFD has a lot of specific documents and procedures that have to be followed. We have those in detail in the appendix, but just going through really broadly here, there's always a CFD boundary map. There's a document called the RMA. There's an acquisition agreement, and then there's that list of authorized facilities and services. Every project has differences between what's in these documents, but each CFD has these, and it helps for the consistency and understanding of this tool. Next slide, please. So the process here is also very public. There are a number of meetings that occur when forming a CFD, so residents are very aware of what's happening. There's also a vote to form the CFD, and you need a majority vote, 2/3 of the qualified electors. That's usually not a problem because the developers are usually the qualified electors at the time of formation, but that's not always the case. Actually, in Marin County, there's a CFD that's being formed to preserve open space, and it's going to be voted on up in this coming election. Next slide, please. So there's all these different steps that we have to go through to sell bonds. I think the important part to talk about is the appraisal of the property that ultimately is viewed as the collateral for the bonds. And so the appraisal helps to value the land that is secured by the bonds. And then it also helps policymakers think about what that special tax burden is going to be relative for each home. And that's important from a policy perspective to not have too high of tax rates on each home. Usually the market and policymakers like to have that amount be below 2%. Next slide, please. The security for the bonds, it's relatively straightforward. That's one of the beauties here. It's just a special tax that gets put on the property tax bill. It's collected through the same mechanism as all other property taxes. There's other funds that help ensure that debt is paid, but what makes this work from the capital markets perspective is there's a foreclosure covenant, and I know it's an awkward thing to talk about, but if people don't pay their special taxes, the issuer has to foreclose on the home. That usually does not happen because we design workarounds to avoid that, but just having that in place ensures that these special taxes get paid. Next slide, please. So there's all these different credit metrics. I hit on the all-in tax burden. There's also coverage requirements that's needed when we sell bonds, and then that value to lien that we talked about as well. And each development is different, so every bond financing is different, and each project is different. But these special taxes really help pay for a lot of that important infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so here's, to close, just to show you the robustness of the market. You know, every year there's about 2 to 3 billion of issuance here to help fund new housing projects. It's anywhere from 80 to 120 different types of CFD transactions that come to market. And, you know, I think what this leaves me with is that there's a lot of great takeaways on this tool. So first, it's a tool that's primarily used for new development. It's a lot easier to craft this type of tax and revenue generation with new development versus existing development. All the financing is pretty much done on a tax-exempt basis. That was important for this tool, also important for the JPA tool discussed previously. And then the security for the bonds is relatively consistent and understandable, and there's a lot of local agency support and action required to make sure that this is a great tool for all parties involved with the process. So I'm happy to answer questions more on the CFD and how it could be a backfill option, but that's the presentation for today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had any, have you looked at tax abatement programs in Seattle, Washington, and New York? Those are two examples that we heard from about 2 months ago. Examples of abatements being used to build housing in a very good and positive way. I was wondering if you have any analysis or any thoughts around that.
You know, I'm not aware of the state of Washington. I did listen to the presentation on New York,
Okay.
so I'm not sure if I can add more color beyond that.
Okay, all right. Just wondering if you had any insights about CFDs. I got to tell you, I'm a former member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and we talked about the Mello-Roos all the time in terms of financing a lot of our projects, open park space, and so it's a real honor to hear your presentation, and then also to meet in real time, I should say, in real time, not in person, but in real time, the ruse of the Mello-Roos. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Let me see if my colleagues have any questions. If not, I have a whole battery, but I don't want to hog. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Vasquez.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. First, let me just thank the former speaker, Roos. I had the pleasure of meeting you back in Santa Monica many, many years ago when you're actually an assembly speaker. And you, Eric, your boss, Ramirez, has come to our town and has done some stuff. Back then, they were doing construction bonds. And now that you're talking about Mello-Roos, what's the difference between, you know, a lot of school districts and cities will float bonds for construction bonds.
Yep.
How is that different from the Mello-Roos construction?
Yeah, so when a school
financing.
or city issues bonds for those types of public facilities, typically they're, again, voted approved bonds, but they're general obligation bonds. And so what happens there is the voters approve additional tax rate on their assessed value to finance those projects. So that's allowed under Prop 13, that kind of voter-approved debt. You know, this is similar to some degree. It just typically serves a different purpose. With the CFD, again, it is voter-approved just by the qualified electors. And it's a special tax. It's not an ad valorem tax. And so that special tax can be really defined any way by that local agency. And but it's a fixed dollar amount, so it doesn't change over time like a GO bond tax rate may change to finance those facilities, or if, you know, more facilities are needed, a school district or city will just issue more GO bonds. So that's hopefully explains the difference there.
So you're saying the benefit with using a Mello-Roos is it's locked in, it's a fixed price versus
Yeah.
a GO bond?
Yeah, it's locked in, and then the other benefit is it's specifically tied typically to a development project. So a very high profile right now is one in San Francisco, like Treasure Island, as an example. So there's a CFD that's helping to pay for all the public infrastructure that's just helping to serve Treasure Island. And so the whole city of San Francisco isn't paying for that public infrastructure like they would in a GEO bond, just the special taxes that are being levied in that specific area of San Francisco.
So, for example, I know a lot of cities throughout the state are looking at some of their municipal airports. Like, we're getting prepared to shut down ours in Santa Monica, and it's 225 acres.
Yeah.
And it's restricted to recreational uses. And I noticed in your presentation, you talked about a Melrose that could be used for parks. Because otherwise, it's a huge expenditure, not
Yeah.
only to build a park, especially if 225 acres, and then to maintain it. And that's something that you would finance. Is that what you're saying, on a fixed price?
You can use that. That's one of the eligible facilities under the Melrose law.
All right, you have to forgive me, but we have a hard stop time right here. You are definitely going to be one of our experts that we continue to check in with. I think that that the speaker was absolutely right. You are very knowledgeable, and it's impressive. So thank you for making time to come up here, and thank you for making the presentation. I'm sorry, colleagues, we don't have time for other conversation at this point. We have to bring in our next group of speakers before we lose them. Thank you, Mr.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Board
Thank you,
members.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All
Thank
right.
you, member.
Thank you. Ms. Cicchetti.
Yes, the next group of speakers are regarding education community perspective. We have a few speakers: Cheryl Idle, Legislative Advocate, California School Boards Association; Katie Hardman, Legislative Advocate, California Teachers Association; Megan Baer, Legislative Advocate, Association of California Schools Administrators. And in addition, there's an Elizabeth Esquivel. Okay, they've all come forward. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies. It's good to see you. Cheryl, how do you pronounce your last name?
Ide.
Ide, okay. Miss Hardiman. Come on, Megan, help me out.
Bear.
Bear.
And then Elizabeth Esquivel with the California Association of School Business Officials.
Great. Thank you very much for being here. This is the California Board of Equalization. You heard our opening remarks. I've seen you in the back of the room, so you've kind of been listening to the conversation. So I'm going to start with Ms. Ide. We'll start here, and then we'll go down that way in terms of presentation.
If I could actually have Katie start. She's
Sure,
gonna
no
do a little
problem.
bit,
We'll
and
start
then-
with you, Ms. Hartman.
Great, thank you, and good morning. I first want to thank the board for including CTA and, many of the education partners here in this important conversation today. Just yesterday, CTA released a survey of TK through 12 teachers in California, which found 80% of the teachers surveyed found it difficult to find affordable housing near where they teach. So, we're with you, we agree. Affordable housing is a significant problem for not only our members, but the families and the communities that they serve. And we want to find solutions for our state's housing shortage. However, we have concerns with reducing property tax revenues, including abatements or deductions, as this would reduce the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee for our schools and community colleges. And I believe Cheryl's going to get into some of the mechanics around how that works. We do appreciate the intent to backfill these lost revenues. However, a backfill would not be guaranteed and would put schools at the mercy of fluctuations in general fund revenues or the revenue source. Historically, the state has often disproportionately reduced funding for schools to close the state's budget deficit, including suspending the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee. So that's sort of the historical context that we have to work with. And then additionally, while education funding has recently increased the past couple years, California's education system has been underfunded for decades and consistently ranks near the bottom in per student funding among the states. For comparison, quickly, New York, which is one of the states that you mentioned and highlighted the use of property tax abatements there, New York is ranked second in the nation in per student funding, and actually dedicates more than $12,000 per student more than we do here in California.
I'm sorry, 12,000
Per student more.
more.
Yes.
So what's the total figure that they?
So the numbers,
25, like 25,
yeah,
26.
the numbers are from a couple years old, but 25,000 per
Thank
student.
you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, they also don't have Prop 13, so there's that. In summary, we urge the board to consider other solutions that do not harm our schools or destabilize education funding. We've submitted a coalition letter with members of, the education community. I have copies if you need one, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much. We did get the letter. Oh, yeah, that's right, we do have, yes, I'm sorry, I got excited. Yes, thank you for your presentation. Who would like to speak next?
I can go next.
Okay.
I'll get in a little bit more of the technical details.
Okay.
Good morning, Chair and members. Cheryl Edat on behalf of the California School Boards Association, and I want to say a big thank you for the opportunity to provide some feedback from schools and the perspective, and specifically how property tax abatements impact our overall funding. So the Proposition minimum guarantee, Proposition 98 minimum guarantee, is currently in a test 1. That's how we fund education in here, and it distributes about 38% of the state's general fund throughout for all schools. We also have the local control funding formula that takes that funding and then distributes on an equitable base, recognizing that each students have different needs based on where they are, if they are low income, if they are foster youth, if they are an English learner, recognizing the challenges there, as well as special education. In a test 1 year, property taxes have a dollar for dollar impact. So every dollar lost is a dollar less in the classroom, which is why we're very sensitive to that. And both the LAO, our colleague formerly who spoke, and the Department of Finance have said that we are in a test 1 for the foreseeable future as far as they forecast out. So we're in a very sensitive condition in that case. Property taxes account for about 25% of our total funding in education, so it's a big piece for us. And our funding is quite vulnerable, as we know, to all of the fluctuations that we see in general fund, while property taxes tend to be the most stable one. So we are very, very sensitive to any kind of imbalances there, and we want to make sure that we have that consistent source of predictability when we look to being able to educate our children. And so while we appreciate the board's focus on the efforts to include a backfill for revenue lost due to the abatements, because that's a really big deal to us, historically, we really just don't have a precedent. We've never seen any kind of backfill seen for any kind of tax expenditures, including any kind of abatements or anything looked at that. And so when we see that the forecasts are that we are in the billions of less in revenue just from Budget Act back in June, we have a lot of concerns about that continuing to be something that we could look forward to and count on that as a sustainable source of revenue for us. And then, as previously stated by my colleague from CTA, we recognize that this is supposed to address the missing middle, which that includes our teachers, our staff, and our students. We want to ensure that because development without 100% security of that backfill isn't going to support the new families that it's going to bring in, and so it's going to put more pressure on our students, not just for today, but for tomorrow as these communities are built. So we believe that there are other targeted programs that you could look to. Many were mentioned by the LAO. We have some that are specifically targeted through Cal HFA for teachers, for classified staff members to be able to access housing. And so, more funds to be able to different programs that we know that we have that are existing, or things that we know don't affect our bottom line and our budgets. And that's what we would recommend as something to look to.
Appreciate that, thank you. Ms. Bayer?
Thank you. Megan Baer with the Association of California School Administrators. We represent about 18,000 members statewide, superintendents, principals, a pretty diverse subset of school leaders. And we really appreciate the attention to this issue. We are literally losing teachers and staff every day because they cannot afford the price of housing. And despite a really good budget last year and the ability of many districts to give raises across the board, it's not enough to combat the incredibly high cost of housing in most of the state. So it's a very important issue, and we very much appreciate the attention. I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues, however. We, in general, have concern with tax abatement, tax credits because of the impact to Prop 98. This is because the way we've designed to fund our education system, frankly. So, we appreciate the attention, and we would just urge consideration of other strategies to combat and tackle this really important issue. Thank you.
I'll be very quick in case you all have any questions, but again, Elizabeth Esquivel with the California Association of School Business Officials, representing 24,000 members throughout the entire state, mainly chief business officials and directors from 13 different disciplines. So our focus is really making sure that we have sustainability within our funding so that we can continue to serve our students in our schools. So we really do appreciate the need to find further funding for housing, but again, continue to express those concerns about putting schools at the mercy of fluctuations in general fund revenue. So for us, it's really just a funding stability that we want to continue to maintain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both Ms. Baer and Ms. Hardiman, you both alluded to encouraging us to look at other solutions. I was curious if you had any solutions that you would like us to consider.
I'm not a housing expert, but I think, given the intent to sort of backfill, right, using general fund, we would encourage instead to just look at using general fund or whatever revenue source
On the front end.
provide, targeted grant programs so that's really targeted to the audience that we're looking at.
Okay, I see you, Mr. Vasquez.
And I would just second that. We would just prefer to see it on the front end, so then if there is a dip in revenues, we don't get left holding the bag when the backfill can't come in because revenues drop.
Yeah, I wanted to know, to just certainly be on the record, I appreciate your, the concerns that you're raising, and this, I don't know if you heard my opening remarks, we're exploring, we don't have preconceived notions, we don't have commitments, we don't have an idea on the direction that we want to go in. This is a genuine, heartfelt process of just exploration. You heard from one of the previous speakers, I don't believe the state of California has moved in this direction before, and perhaps this is probably this could be a reason why. So we're just exploring all of our options and seeing what's out there. So I just wanted to assure you of that. Mr. Vasquez?
Yes, thank you for your presentations, and as a former teacher, I'm very sensitive to not only the needs that you have coming forward in the future with education, but just salaries. When I was teaching, it was ridiculous what they were paying teachers. Not that it's much better now, but I was wondering, on the housing front, do you have, I guess it may be more of a question from the CTA, looking at the state level of the districts, and maybe you folks on the other side with the administrators. Do you know of any kind of an inventory? I asked the superintendent, and he wasn't aware of one, that would give us what vacant lots districts have sitting idling throughout the state of California that possibly could be used for workforce housing.
Right.
Because that wouldn't impact taxes, and it wouldn't take anything away from your budget.
Right. I don't have an inventory. I can check around, but I don't think we track that.
We don't have a statewide inventory. I know that there are districts that have floated ideas like that, but I haven't heard of any of them coming to fruition.
Okay.
And there have been, ideas in the legislature around incentivizing districts to develop housing on, vacant lots and district-owned lands. I think some of the heartburn that we have is, our school districts then becoming landlords and all of those issues that play into that. So it's a complex issue for sure.
Yeah, there's other things too, if I can chime in a little bit. Some of the conditions in which you have for building as far as low-income housing, they may be so low because they're at the federal level, they don't necessarily encompass those salaries that we have at district levels. You mentioned that they're low salaries, but they're not low enough considering the federal level. So when you combine those types of tax credits at those thresholds, it actually eliminates most school staff to be able to access the housing that they were to build on their vacant lots and surplus property.
Well, at some point, it'd be good to, the superintendent sounds like he's willing to work with us, and maybe they need to work with you folks, especially CTA, that has access to all these districts, because it sounds like it's more of a district-wide thing that we could do. At least they have them look at inventory, not only of vacant lots, but maybe underutilized lots that they have. Because I know LAUSD had this big boom. They were building so many schools, and I think a lot of them are very underutilized now, the schools, because enrollment hasn't taken off to the projections that they thought.
Yep.
Okay.
Any questions down here? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. I appreciate it. And we had Brian Euler here from the LAO, and he did have the suggestion of the state making tax payments up front. Would that avoid the Prop 98 issue that you raised earlier?
I don't believe so, but I'd have to check on how the mechanics would work there. But again, I think we would still have concerns around the volatility of general fund to make those payments, right? Instead of,
Okay.
just being straight property tax.
Okay. And I'm just wondering if these, you're representing numerous organizations, but in terms of CEQA reform, would you be willing to sit at the table in terms of taking a look at that and figuring out a pathway? Because that in and of itself is another avenue in terms of reducing construction costs in California.
There's actually, trailer bill included a piece of CEQA reform as far as schools' ability to institute impact mitigation. In this most recent trailer bill, AB 185 specifically, that created additional steps for us to take place in order to mitigate, to use CEQA mitigation as part of our process. It makes it more difficult for us, I would note that. CEQA mitigation is something that, can be used because if we don't have the facilities to be able to house the children that the development brings in, it makes it more difficult for us to utilize that. So I would add that it's something that we've already kind of touched that line, and so we're pretty sensitive to it right now.
Yeah. Are you saying that you're suffering some of the same challenges that home builders are?
No.
From a CEQA standpoint, or?
So because districts are, local districts are, effectively local governments in a way, we actually have the ability to use CEQA when there's development that doesn't, and there's not enough funding to be able to support the construction of schools to be able to pay for it. So it is one of the tools in our toolkit to ensure that schools are built. But when the state doesn't have enough revenue to be able to support the construction of schools and the bond authority is used up, it is something that we can use to say, hey, the development has to, we have to really watch this. We have to make sure that we get funding so that we can build the schools to be able to support the kids that come in.
Okay.
So I mentioned that, and that it is something, that kind of reform is something that we have already just recently touched, and we're very sensitive of it.
Okay. All right. Very well. Thank you.
Is there any, yes?
I just wanted to quickly add to Mr. Gaines' comment about just a declining population in the state. We're seeing the same trend with schools and school districts. And so whether we're currently funded on the ADA, the average daily attendance, there's conversations about being funded on enrollment, but despite being funded through ADA or enrollment, we're still seeing the trend of declining enrollment, which is again how we are being funded. So this brings back that cautiousness of the uncertainty when it comes to the stability of how we're funded and the funds that we receive.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just wanted to again reaffirm that we heard you, and we'll take your feedback under serious advisement. I'm a public school kid, so I'm, like Mr. Gaines, really sensitive to the concerns that you all raised today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's Mr. Gaines, but this is Mr. Vasquez. Mr. Vasquez, yes, I did, thank you. All right, thank you.
How did the fourth lady miss out getting it named?
I don't know.
Can't solve everything.
Right, exactly. Okay, Ms. Cicchetti.
Yes, the next group of speakers to present are from the city and county government perspective. The speakers are Mark Nuremberg, Legislative Advocate, California State Association of Counties; Jeffrey Neal, Legislative Advocate, California State Association of Counties; and Nicholas Romo, Legislative Affairs, Lobbyist, Revenues and Taxation, League of California Cities.
Oh, fantastic. We had a panel of ladies, now we have a panel of men. I love this. This is pretty interesting. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I've saw you in the back of the chamber. You've seen and heard a lot of the conversation for the last 2 hours now. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Mr. Nuremberg, I have you on my agenda to go first. Is that okay? Or do you want to?
Actually, I'll have Jeff go first.
All right. There it is, Mr. Neal. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and always good to see a couple of former county supervisors in state office. As I want to start with a response to Mr. Euler's comments earlier, where he felt uncomfortable or uneasy, I think he said, speaking for local agencies, that we would be uncomfortable with reimbursement of the property tax, and he was spot on. I think that is, as with the education panel just before us, that would make us uneasy for exactly the reasons that they noted. The legislature cannot bind a future legislature, so the reimbursement is certainly good in the year that it's first appropriated, and then after that, it's always up to the whims, I guess, of the future legislators, the next year or 5 years down the line, whenever it is. There are a number of, so the upfront funding holds, I think, a lot more promise if all of the funding is provided at once upfront. If it's over a 5-year period, I think you run in, to the same issue again. If there's some way of locking that in. It would create some more certainty. There are, and so that upfront payment on behalf of the developer could work that Mr. Euler was mentioning, but there are still issues around it. If there's a liability for non-payment, if it is, not, for example, constitutionally required or required by the terms of a bond or some other more secure device like that. The other models that we've heard about or that we've considered all have different reasons for concern, whether that's for a reduction in revenue, sometimes just a cash flow issue. You get the money later, but you have to give it up for now. A lot of local agencies have or have cash flow needs that are already barely being met. Or sometimes workload issues, because the property tax is the only tax, the only major tax in California anyway, that is administered entirely at the local level. The state isn't involved at any point in the process. Any changes to the way the property tax is done does, in terms of collecting, assessing, collecting, and distributing the money. Of course, the utilities and railroads accepted, since that's the BOE. So the Mello-Roos idea, that was mentioned earlier is interesting in this context. I just want to address it because the previous speaker did, or the prior to the education panel, because in the case of developments, the delaying the tax, paying the bond and then having it be paid off over a number of years, it makes it easier for the developer because the developer doesn't have to bear that cost. It is then borne by the people who purchase the homes that are built with all that infrastructure that the Mello-Roos bond paid for. My understanding was that in this case, the units would be rented out instead of sold, so presumably it would be the same owner. So it sounds like they would just be deferring their own tax liability to a later date. And so I'm curious if that affects the usefulness of the model for this purpose. My last comment is just the to the point of having local agencies decide whether to implement this in their communities. That it's just to point out that the property tax growth, especially over the last 10 or 15 years, has been very uneven in this state, and many counties, most counties in fact, have less revenue per capita, property tax revenue per capita, than they did before the Great Recession, now over a decade ago, in real dollars. And so those are the sorts of things that can be taken into account when the decisions are made locally, but are harder when it's the state making it on behalf of a local community.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I want to thank the board for the invitation. I'm Mark Newberger with the California State Association of Counties. I'm the legislative representative for housing, land use, and transportation issues. Counties definitely recognize the state's housing supply challenges and understand the need to take steps to address that, which the proposed tax abatement policy would do. But in regards to the specific proposal, from a housing and land use perspective, we would recommend any proposal retain local control aspects and not be a by-right program. And essentially, coming from the perspective that this would allow counties to ensure that housing development seeking this kind of tax abatement, that they would align with county plans and assist counties in meeting their portion of the Housing Community Development's regional housing needs allocation that their counties are responsible for ensuring gets built in the future. a major part of the county control perspective is to support county efforts to incentivize housing development projects that might be eligible for any sort of tax abatement, to make sure that they address the low and the middle income housing supply that's missing from the state's housing supply and continues to be a challenge for the state to meet. That's the main kind of a goal that counties are interested in ensuring that they can do to meet the state's housing needs. And I'll pass it along to Mr. Romo.
All right, thank you.
Hi there.
Hi, Mr.
Nick
Romo.
Romo with the League of California Cities. Thank you, Chair, for the invitation. I'll sound like a broken record, but since 2011, the dissolution of redevelopment, cities have really been proactive to try to rebuild that tool with some intention to bring back the ability to build affordable housing, economic development, and economic development projects. One of the things that was done when we recreated, and we've been using the Melrose bonds, but we recreated enhanced infrastructure financing districts, community reinvestment act district. It's a whole alphabet soup of available tools. One of the things that was done was to protect in all those tools, the school share property tax is exempt from the property tax increment. So the schools are protected locally. One of the things we've been asking, and that does diminish the power of those tools. But one of the things we've been doing, and I think we could work with the board here and a lot of state leaders, we've been asking for years for the state to invest, $500 million a year at least to help cities and counties build up the tax increment financing districts or to support the Melrose bond process. The state will be involved in deciding kind of what types of projects are invested in, which in this case could be affordable housing projects across different AMIs. So we think that we could be proactive in this space. We can protect some of the schools' property tax issues. We can let local governments decide how much to invest while protecting the local property taxes to the degree that they know best to do, while the state can also be involved as a partner with local governments to invest in the types of projects it wants to see. The types of projects I believe this working group wants to see, just missing middle projects. And in this way, it does achieve, in some ways, what all the previous speakers have said, talking about how to invest and multiply the amount of money that we need. We all know we need a significant amount of money, and that could be a huge hit to the state budget. But if it's money from the state budget is used to multiply local investments, I think then we're really tapping into lots of funds for these sorts of projects. So League of Cities last year and the year prior has been asking for significant ongoing significant state budget investments. It could be year over year as the state looks at its budget condition, but to help us really build out what the post-redevelopment world looks like. Cities are ready to do this. We have dozens of EIFDs, we call them, enhanced infrastructure financing districts. We have dozens of those in the works. We have two of them just in our own backyard here. The City of West Sac and City of Sacramento have been working on these tools, but they lack the state investments that are needed. And I think in this way, we can help protect what we need to protect and invest in what we want to invest in. So, and that way, I think we share the cost as a whole, across our communities to the housing that we need to build. So I'm really excited, and Cal Cities is really excited to partner with all of you to try to get those investments, have them be intentional, and direct those to the type of housing we'd like to see built.
Okay, what type of housing would you like to see built?
Well, we need housing of all kinds, we know that. But we do see that the missing middle is a key portion, right? But we know that the hardest nut to crack is that sort of really affordable housing. But I think it's all the above. That's Cal Cities' position, it's all the above housing. And so if this is a tool we'd like to use, I think certainly we can work on directing some of those funds to tackle these types of projects and help the development of these projects.
Thank you. Let me see, Mr. Gaines, do you have a question? Mr. Schaefer? Okay, Mr.
I do.
Gaines?
Yeah, if I
Go
could.
ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thank you. My question is of Jeffrey Neal, and thank you for your presentation. And I'm just trying to get a handle on the per capita revenue as it relates to property tax, because it's my understanding with Prop 8, you have the ability to reduce value, right? We went into the Great Recession. But the county also has the ability to increase that tax as those values come back. And so I was of the understanding that we had gained back all those losses in value and maybe even exceeded it. But you're telling me something different, and can you give me a little bit more information so I understand that better?
Sure, I'd be happy to. A couple of things. One is that in several counties, they've had very healthy property tax increases to that point. When you look at the number of counties, as you know, for example, in the area of the state that you're from, the counties are small. There's not as many. There's a lot of counties in less populated areas. That's part of it. Part of it is that we're looking at it in, as population grows and as inflation increases, those are cost pressures. So we're really looking at the amount of services that you can buy with the amount of property tax. So in plain dollar amounts, if you just look at it, I think essentially every county is recovered. But the other piece of it is that a number of things happened in the Great Recession that weren't just Prop 8 reductions, that for the properties that changed hands, for example, in the areas where there are a lot of foreclosures, Prop 13 locks in the assessed value at the, in those cases, foreclosure prices.
Okay.
And so you have a home, for example, or another building that could be worth several $100,000, but it was bought in foreclosure for $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 or $80,000. As long as it doesn't change hands, for example, if it was bought by an investor that's then holding on to it, that because Prop 13 it locks in that value.
Sure.
So there were a number of things that
Okay.
that occurred, but part of it is the increase in population. Part of it's the effect of inflation, not
Yes,
currently,
okay.
but
So
just
per
normal.
capita, that would decline, even if the revenue was the same.
Yes.
It
And so
would
it's the
decline
amount
with
of-
more
So what
people.
we're looking at with that
Yeah.
analysis, the amount of services that you can provide to,
Yes, okay.
people in the community.
Right, and if you're buying a home at let's say it was half price because of the Great Recession, and you bought that home, then you would lock that value in, which is great for the homeowner, right? Because
yeah,
that
right.
value only goes up 1% a year, but it hurts you from a government perspective in terms of revenue coming in and providing services.
And I think the last piece of it is really just that the recovery, the early years of the recovery in particular were very localized. They
Okay.
weren't broad-based.
Okay.
So I think that's another.
That's
piece.
very helpful. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Mr. Newenberg, you don't get a question.
That's fine.
But hope that you will remain available to us if we reach out to you for more, for clarification. Thank you, gentlemen, for making this a priority and joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ms. Cicchetti?
The last group of speakers on this topic to present are from the labor perspective. We have Jeremy Smith, Deputy Legislative Director, State Building and Construction Trade Council.
All right. How you doing, Mr. Smith? It's good to see you.
Well, thank you. President Meredith sends his regrets. He's actually chairing a executive board meeting of the State Building Trades Council as we
Not a
speak,
problem.
previously scheduled. So
Understood.
you are stuck with me today. Appreciate the time.
We receive you
Mr.
with
Gaines. Thank
open
you.
arms.
Thank you.
So why don't we go ahead and jump right in? Let's hear your presentation.
I'm ready to go.
Thank you.
We appreciate the opportunity to be invited to speak on the policy proposal of property tax abatements to spur the development of affordable housing. As I said, my name is Jeremy Smith. I'm the Deputy Legislative Director of the State Building and Construction Trades Council. We are the umbrella organization of construction trades unions in California and represent over 450,000 construction workers along with over 70,000 apprentices. 3/4 of our apprentices are people of color. 1 in 5 come from foster care or emancipated youth or come from the criminal justice system. And we advocate for them as part of the labor movement for their wages, benefits, health, and safety. And of all the women in apprenticeship in California, the majority are in joint labor management programs jointly managed by our contractor partners, the programs of the building trades. Our members and their working families across the economic spectrum are increasingly spending more of their income on housing costs. We are the labor movement, the construction labor movement. We tend to make higher salaries, better wages than other parts of the economy, and even our members are struggling in certain parts of the state. They feel this as acutely as anyone else. Even for many of our members, it's impossible to afford fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, let alone entertain the dream of owning their own home. We want to be part of a solution to that. But we cannot address one crisis by causing another. And we cannot allow the solution to be the cause of exploitation of residential construction workers. Let me start with the availability of a workforce. Many previous speakers from your July hearing, have lamented the, quote, lack of available workers, unquote. We heard from speakers who, quote, believe, unquote, there are not enough construction workers to meet the demand, and who have heard that it's hard to find construction workers, who claim also that there are not enough training opportunities for women, people of color, or veterans. We heard that the state needs to do outreach to attract more second chance workers. Not one person stated how many workers the industry actually needed. They just know, quote unquote, that there aren't enough. We could not disagree more. We would instead say that there aren't enough workers willing to work for low wages, and that is most likely the cause of the shortage that developers complain about. The building trades, in partnership with our contractors, provide opportunities to workers from all walks of life. As I mentioned, they are jointly administered state-approved apprenticeship programs. We train veterans through the Helmets to Hard Hats program, provide pre-apprenticeship training through the multi-craft core curriculum, and as I mentioned, train the largest number of women and minorities in the California state-approved apprenticeship system. And we provide that training at almost no cost, in many cases free, to anyone who wants it. We believe the available workforce exists if housing developers could see past the business model that results in the exploitation of construction workers. Instead, we heard in previous meetings of this body on this issue without proof that there aren't enough workers, and that one way to provide more workers is to reform the immigration system. To us, that means finding workers who are in a position to be exploited and to do heavy construction work, real construction work, for the low wages in the underground economy. We heard that we need to open up the workforce to more ergonomically easier work by incentivizing factory and modular construction, an industry that exists to make a profit by taking jobs away from construction workers. We heard about all kinds of different ways to not use the ready and available workforce that already exists, apprentices and journeymen and journeywomen who are graduates of state-approved apprenticeship programs. We believe the profit motive, the obsession to make money providing desperately needed housing that we all agree is needed, is a real problem. And I'll reiterate again, we represent 450,000 construction workers. We represent 70,000 apprentices in the state-approved apprenticeship system, which is a number that we think is more than willing and able to meet the demand. Listening back to your previous hearings earlier this summer, I was struck by how many speakers were here who have a vested interest in the system, who make money off the system. We agree with some of them that reforms are needed to the housing finance system and that the dissolution of RDAs has severely hampered the ability to build. However, whether it was developers, builders, or advocates for affordable housing, we heard over and over about the need for more money from the state, more streamlining, and more help with permitting, despite the fact that there have been several bills and regulatory changes in the last decade that provide all of that. Yet here we all are, still debating this issue, all in the name of making profit off the system and unfortunately off the backs of a low-wage, largely immigrant-driven workforce willing to work on job sites in the underground economy for low wages where robust labor, health, and safety laws are ignored. Unfortunately, as we've seen in residential construction and other industries such as warehouse work, farm work, and the gig economy, exploitation of workers is still rampant. We know this is happening. We organize workers who tell us that they were paid under the table, often in cash with no benefits or protections under the law on residential job sites. We hear stories of workers who felt they had no ability to speak for themselves or their coworkers because they feared retaliation. What some of the previous speakers want are workers that they can pay substandard wages to who are not empowered by their legal rights and will not dare complain about safety on the job or incorrect pay stubs. Some of the very workers who spoke in recent panels represent some of those developers who exploit workers. Not all developers are bad. I'm not painting a broad brush here. However, many of those groups oppose every single bill that is proposed or amended at the legislature that deals with housing streamlining that also require the use of a skilled and trained workforce. Amendments to legislation we always insist on. This requirement to use a skilled and trained workforce means that a percentage of the workers on the job site are graduates of state-approved apprenticeship programs. And there are non-union and union state-approved apprenticeship programs. This is not a union, non-union battle thing here. What might be most important about the skilled and trained workforce requirements is that it doesn't just mean that workers are experts in their craft. It means they know their value as a worker. They know when they or their colleagues are being taken advantage of, and they are empowered to blow the whistle. They know their worth as a worker, and that is exactly why some developers don't want them on job sites. The labor movement exists to thwart bad actors in the employment space who have used and will use any sliver of daylight in statute to not treat blue-collar workers legally and with respect. A favorite buzz phrase from the developer community is that strong labor standards such as skilled and trained won't allow housing projects to, quote, pencil out, unquote. Treating workers and their families fairly should always pencil out. What doesn't pencil out is the amount of money the public would need to provide to help build enough affordable housing to cover the need that is driven by poverty wages and no benefits. As it stands, data show 40% of the people enrolled in California's mean-tested safety net programs are from unrepresented residential construction working families. So we're already subsidizing the profits of these developers. It's appropriate that publicly subsidized housing projects set the highest standard for public benefit, and that includes job quality standards. I want to say one word about CEQA, a couple words about CEQA, then I'll wrap up.
I was going to say just one on CEQA.
A couple.
Okay.
I encourage you all to look at the analysis for SB 1118 from the Senate Judiciary Committee from this past session. All the data are complete according to the analysis. 3 recent studies have found CEQA litigation rates of between 1% and 3%. We've heard often here that CEQA is the problem, that streamlining needs to happen. It's important to note that discovery in CEQA cases is generally not allowed, as CEQA cases are generally restricted to review of the record. The concurrent preparation of the record of the proceedings is required to enable judicial review to occur sooner. Counties with a population of over 200,000 must designate 1 or more judges to develop expertise on CEQA and hear CEQA cases. And that if feasible, the Court of Appeal must hear a CEQA appeal within 1 year of filing. To wrap up, we are here today to be the voice of workers. We understand that there's a housing shortage in the state. Our members feel it acutely. I am grateful for the opportunity to tell you about the way that workers are treated in the residential housing market in California and urge you to not forget about those who will actually build this housing as you debate the property tax abatement policy proposal and all housing policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. One of the things that became very apparent in the first certainly in the first work session, was that we needed to have that labor voice, that labor perspective. So I'm really glad you were able to make this a priority to be here. And I know you don't represent everybody, but you do represent a very important chunk of the labor community. And let me see if my colleague, I knew he had a question. Mr. Vasquez.
Just a quick one, I was raised in a labor household, so I know how important it is to make sure this happens. And when I was the mayor in Santa Monica, we always had project labor agreements, which I think are real key in what you're addressing here. And at least as we move forward, I'll constantly bring that up.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Do you have any other advice? You watch the tapes, you watch the film, you've heard from maybe you're an affiliate in the labor movement from the teachers, the educators in particular, some of their concerns. You might have heard in discussion talking about CEQA. You brought it up a little bit, and a push for more reform. Anything else that you can give us that we should take under consideration as we continue to explore this topic?
Well, I think you're on the right track here with the 30,000-foot level idea of providing funding for housing. I mentioned RDAs; those went away. That was a big hit. In talking to some housing developers that might sound like I'm angry at today, we did spend time talking to each other, not past each other, and I learned about them, and I learned some of the hurdles they face in creating affordable housing, and I believe they're real. I think the state auditor also came out with a report a couple years ago about some ongoing issues with the system. I think, though, this idea that there be a specific type of state funding just for housing, like the teachers have with Prop 98 and the schools have with Prop 98, dedicated just to it, is something I think we would all agree on that needs to happen, because the state should have a role here. And part of that role, especially in times of very flush budgets as we're in right now, which may not last forever, setting aside specific money that is there every year for housing is something that we would be very interested in looking at and seeing if we could support along the way. Of course, as long as it comes with robust standards for workers who are going to build the housing.
Okay, so I assume you're going to be our partner as we continue to unfold and walk down this pathway.
Of course. We
are just about out of time. We have our next speaker coming. Mr. Schaefer, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I was just going to say I'm very impressed to hear that, is it 3/4 of the apprentices are people of color?
Yes, according to DAS standards, statistics, the Division of Apprenticeship Standards tracks this.
Yeah, because construction has always been pretty good pay, and This sounds to me like we're bringing, upgrading economically to our more difficult neighborhoods, and I'm so pleased to hear that.
We are. Thank you for noting that.
All right, thank you very much.
Question, if I could?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, just in terms of CEQA reform, because I keep harping on it, and I think it is an issue and it needs to be addressed in terms of cost of construction in California. But you had mentioned Senate Bill 1118, which I'm not familiar with. So could you just go through a couple of the highlights in terms of what was happening there? And
Yeah, Senator Borges, I think, Senator Borges was the author of that bill.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
he shares some of your concerns about the CEQA issues in this state. That was
Yeah.
a bill that he introduced to fix a problem he thought existed with the
Yeah.
CEQA process.
Yes,
The Judiciary Committee made a very good analysis about that bill and noted in there about whether there was a need for the bill, given the low rates of CEQA lawsuits. I can't think of the right word. CEQA proceedings that actually occur in the state, between 1% and 3%. But it was a bill that was getting at some of the issues you've raised here today.
I see, okay.
I just wanted to, I thought it was important to highlight kind of the analysis from the kind of third parties, right?
Yeah, I'll take a look at
the
it.
folks. Yeah,
Just-
I would encourage
yeah.
you to, because they have the links to the studies in there.
Okay.
That talk about where they got that data.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you,
Yeah.
appreciate it.
It's nice to see you again, Senator.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Keep your
Madam
eyes
Chair.
and your ears watching this board. We are
We-
going to be making some moves.
We definitely will. Thank you for including us. We
Of
appreciate
course,
that.
And give my best to Mr. Meredith.
I definitely will. He
Thank you.
apologizes again.
All right, Mr. Ketty, what do we have next?
Well, we could go to the AT&T moderator to finish up this issue and then go to the mayor. Or we could
Okay.
go the other way around.
Let's go to the mayor first. Is
Okay.
the mayor on?
Mhm. Yes, he is.
Okay, we're going to hear from Mayor Garcetti,
Mm-hmm.
the Honorable Mayor Eric Garcetti from the City of Los Angeles. Hello, Mr. Mayor. Is that a
Hello,
picture or is
how
that
you
really you? Oh, okay.
It's really me. Great to be with you.
All right,
Thank you so much.
fantastic. It's good to see you.
As well. Thank you. I appreciate really your focus so much on what I always say is the number 1, 2, and 3 issue in California: housing, housing, and housing. Almost everything in the California dream flows through our ability to build, maintain, preserve, and make accessible housing throughout California. The governor has often given me credit for something I once shared with him, that I noticed, we have the American dream and the California dream. It's not that people don't dream in other states, but that phrase doesn't exist as the Kansas dream or the Maine dream or the Florida dream. We have something very unique in California that's been predicated on our incredible jobs, our public education system, our great weather, and of course, accessible and abundant and affordable housing, which unfortunately, if you look at that fourth thing, while we still have great weather and great people and amazing jobs that continue to grow here, really our lack of being able to preserve and expand affordability for housing is the greatest threat, I think, to this state. You don't have to be homeless to see it, but you can feel it on our streets and homelessness, all the way up to a middle class that really questions whether it can stay. So thank you for your focus on this. Here in Southern California, we had a very historic RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment, that was very controversial to go through, but we finally had a majority of all the 100+ cities in our 5-county region, the 88 cities of LA County, that showed a need for about 457,000 new units to be built of housing in just 8 years. 185,000 of those have to be for low and very low income, another 75,000 or so for moderate income residents. And so while we're doing everything to deploy all sorts of tools, from our zoning, our transit-oriented development, for instance, has been abundantly successful, producing about half of the housing we now build and encouraging affordable housing without subsidy, or whether it's looking at our work with accessory dwelling units, the artist formerly known as granny flats, which is now a quarter of our new construction. We're seeing people really answer this call. To put this in context, LA was building about a third the amount of overall housing 9 years ago when I took over as mayor, as we are every year now. But to my successor, who will be elected in just about 60 days or so, I say to her or to him, we're going to have to double that again in order to meet those goals. So we are being ambitious on the policy front. Our voters passed the largest homeless housing measure in the nation's history, which is building about and leveraging 12,000 units of permanent supportive housing 2 years earlier and cheaper than we promised and 1,000 more units than we had hoped, but it's still not enough. And so, the property tax exemption that you're focused on is such an important tool in incentivizing affordable housing. It reduces for us the monthly costs of operating each affordable unit by $500, about 40% of total operating costs. I just came from an opening yesterday in South Los Angeles, talked to 2 new residents who had been collectively on the streets for the last 40 years, between the 2 of them, 2 decades each. And we see the impact of how homelessness is now ended for them, how opportunity is expanded. One of the tenants, he has an Instagram account. He's a photographer. He's 77 years old and has been homeless for 20 years. And I'm already following him. He's talented. He's dealing with his bipolarity with case manager. But we need to do more. And I think there's a few things I can suggest to you that would be helpful. First of all, we support the expansion of the exemption to cover workforce housing with residents earning up to 120% of median income. This really will incentivize more production at that missing middle and help us get to our RENA goals. But in addition, we know on the side, I think that the Board of Equalization can be very helpful on the process, not just the actual granting of the exemption, and getting the organizational clearance certificates and supplemental clearance certificates to get welfare exemptions. As we know, prior to 2007, this was centralized at BOE, but now pushing this down to the county assessor's office in each county, most of whom do this very unevenly, talking to developers who work across California, it's very uneven. And maybe BOE could be helpful by requiring all the counties follow BOE's recommended process, even working with the legislature to put a time limit on how long a county can take to do that, and not have the authority to request more information than required by BOE unless specifically approved by BOE. A key change I also recommend is to allow affordable housing projects to obtain exemptions as soon as the affordable covenant is recorded on the site. We just recently worked with an affordable housing developer who has 0 subsidy from any government source. When we give them the permits, they're able to build and to open up their doors in 13 months.
Wow.
They have enough money to be able to create 900 permanent supportive housing units this year, sell those off quickly and get that $100 million back into circulation to do another one. But they came to us saying, look, the city of LA, which is faster than most places, adds another 6 months to that. So that makes 20 months. And when we look at things like some of the exemption, waiting a few months might seem like fine for us, but you pile these on and then people say, why does it take 5 years for an affordable housing thing to get built? Well, cities are guilty. BOE is guilty, or county assessor's office and others. But I think instead of waiting until a project's completed and then placed in service and then requesting a refund, let's do that at the recording of the affordable covenant on a land site. I think it would also be helpful to allow property tax exemptions for all uses on a project if all are nonprofit uses, not necessarily nonprofit owners. They would be eligible for an exemption even when affordable housing development, a for-profit entity potentially, owns the site and leases the space to the other nonprofit users. Let me give you an example of that. Here in Los Angeles, we had an affordable housing project on a church parking lot. It included, among other uses, 49 housing units and parking for the church, a child care center that was operated by the YMCA. And all these uses we know make sense together. If you're a family, you need child care, you need parking, you need to be able to have housing. But each was operated by entities that could secure an exemption if they own the site on their own. But in order to secure the exemption for each use, we had to have this complicated air rights subdivision so that each nonprofit owned its own project rather than just the Y and the church leasing from the affordable housing project. So if we can figure out a way to just allow, if they're all nonprofit uses, to have a single exemption for everybody on that site, that would be extremely helpful too. And lastly, the property tax exemption requires that the managing general partner of all tax credit partnerships be a nonprofit that materially participates, that's the quote, materially participates in the development and operations of the project in order to be eligible for the exemption. Although this has supported the role of mission-based nonprofits, it's also that bring a commitment to the operating of that affordable housing well over the long term. It's also opened the door to nonprofits who operate primarily to technically fill this role of the managing general partner, but who don't add capacity or resources to the partnership. So the regulations require that the nonprofits be true partners, but this is difficult to enforce well. So I think it's time to review the efficacy of this requirement, maybe find a better rule that effectively ensures the public benefits of having nonprofits involved in an easier way for everybody. So that's straight to the point. I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Vasquez, for the invitation. I know that you had our amazing general manager of the housing department with you, Ann Sewell, and she is an extraordinary resource, not just running great department, but from her work at the California Community Foundation before. So please reach out to us. Happy to answer any questions if I can. Azine from my team is here too. He might know things even better than me if it gets too technical. But I hope that's helpful, and thank you for being a part of this. A lot of people have said, well, everything we're doing doesn't work. I think for the first time in my life, I finally see realistic goals, a destination we can get around, a highway that's built, and a car that's finally constructed. We're starting to put gas, or maybe in this day and age, we're starting to charge that car, but we don't want to take it apart. A lot of people who throw up their hands, I say, well, so if you're saying we don't fund these things, if we don't streamline these things, if we don't densify, if we don't fund, somehow we're going to build a better car in 3 or 4 years from now, and that's going to solve our housing crisis. We know this requires us all to be in that car together, to make sure it's running smoothly, has the energy it needs to move forward. And I appreciate you being clear mechanics in that process. And it's an honor to serve alongside you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have a one question, and then I'm going to pivot to Mr. Vasquez. And one of the things that we've heard a lot of discussion around this morning and now into the afternoon was issuing general obligation bonds or revenue bonds by state or local governments to pay for the backfill. And I wanted to see if you or maybe Azine had any thoughts or thoughts that you could share with us. You spent a number of years on the local level, running a very large city, lots of property tax revenue coming in to the county by Assessor Jeff Prang, great guy. But as we walk down this line of considering tax abatement as a tool to help build affordable housing, one thing that we're starting to hear now is, particularly from our allies in the education department, is they're very concerned about not having enough money for public education. And so the conversation has been really focused around backfill. And wanted to just get maybe your thoughts or feelings on issuing general obligation bonds or revenue bonds by local governments to pay for the backfill.
I don't know that we would do that in Los Angeles. I mean, just because of our credit ratings and other considerations where that would be somewhat risky, quite frankly, for future administrations and obligations in the future. Azine can chime in on this too. But I think the greater threat to our public education, quite frankly, is people leaving because it's unaffordable to stay. That's really when you're going to see a depression of revenues. And also, as we're seeing in Los Angeles now, not enough students for our schools. So the fixed costs of our schools remain, but families can't afford to stay in places like Los Angeles. So we're chasing two different things. I would say any emphasis where we don't envision that you're losing the tax revenues because of this, because of the exemptions, but that you're actually ensuring that we will continue to have students, that the local school districts will get the per child reimbursements for their attendance every single day, instead of having now schools that are 40, 50, 60% filled and have to be closed down. Employees have to be laid off. I would say that is a bigger threat. But Azine, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on I haven't heard anything, and I would think that it would be something we would be very hesitant to do, at least at the city level.
So we've heard the same from other fellow mayors on Riverside, Fresno, as well as Santa Monica. So I just wanted to check in to see if you had any differing opinion. Mr. Vasquez.
First of all, Mayor, thanks for finding the time to join us. I know we were going back and forth the last couple of days. Really appreciate it. But in your experience, and I know you're now finishing up your term here as the mayor, and I know you've been real creative because I've gone to a couple of the groundbreakings that you've done in the city of LA, and there's one coming up this Friday again. And what from your experiences could you share with us that we could do maybe a better job at, especially I'm thinking on the tax credit side, the abatement side, and even possibly finding out a way to maybe streamline the permitting process a little bit at the state level, because I think we're part of the problem.
There's no question, and this is probably beyond the scope of just the Board of Equalization, but it is the most important question. And I should have said, by the way, it's always a joy to join with you and all the members. So thank you for the invitation. I'm glad it worked out. But, you know, I want to give you a very blunt comparison. We're coming in, as I mentioned, about 15,000, I didn't say the exact number, but 15,000 less per unit in city subsidy for the projects that we just went to a ribbon cutting yesterday. As you mentioned, there's one on Friday. I used to go to one a quarter, by the way. We're going to 1 or 2 a week. So we're really cooking with oil now. But we compared what it costs, even with us coming in at a lower level for the city subsidy. Of course, there's the state tax credits, sometimes state grants, and there's often project-based vouchers from our housing authorities, the sandwich that we all know that it takes for subsidized affordable housing. In the cheapest, most efficient places, those are coming in a city like LA, north of $450,000, $500,000. Now, it's unfair to always say that's the price of a unit because these buildings often have childcare, they have facilities for maybe mental health care and other things in there, and that's divided into the cost of each unit of housing. So a normal housing project doesn't have that. So the per unit cost is a little lower, but the overall cost of the building divided by units results in that. We recently went to a groundbreaking for a privately financed permanent supportive housing unit that will come in about $200,000 total, about half the price or less than half the price. And I've been digging deep into this saying, how is that even possible? It's going to have services, by the way, so it's not just the housing without the services. Like a lot of the things we do here, the land is donated. This was on a church parking lot. When I talked with the folks, they've raised $100 million in private capital. They are able to then work with a developer who's only making about 5%. Because they don't have to wait for the 2 to 3 year process of getting the state tax credits and the loan and the this and the that and the local money and the project vouchers. They have the money in place. They have the bank already waiting. They said about $40,000 in legal fees versus $1 million on average with other folks just for the legal fees. Nobody's bilking the system, but that's what we require developers to have in order to navigate the legal requirements that come from the state and sometimes the federal government. I asked, was it labor? Is it because it doesn't trigger a prevailing wage? He said, no, labor is a very small piece of it. We still pay basically the same as prevailing wage. They don't have to, but they pay about the same. So it's not that our tradesmen and women are getting less money. And the speed with which they can do this, like I said, as soon as they get their permit, means it's a 13-month build out before people are moving in. So I would just say, if we're going to get serious about this, we have way too many funding sources into affordable housing. We're very proud that in Los Angeles we'll build about 2,400 units of permanent supportive housing this year. That's a new record. We were doing about 300 a year when I started, so it's almost a tenfold increase. But that company that I was mentioning, it's actually a revolving fund, will build 900 units without a single dollar from us. So it's maybe more than a third more to the overall LA City numbers at half the price. So I think there's some real hard thinking we have to do, some sharpening the pencils. We have accepted for 2 or 3 decades that affordable housing is difficult. We need 4 or 5 sources of funding. That takes time. It's complicated. Even if we were to stay with 4 or 5 sources of funding, why do we require different dates for all of them? We should require local governments align their local money with the state programs, and then we should require the state ones to do it together. We should have the housing authorities or any county money aligned with it. And we should say a couple times a year, this date in spring, this date in fall is a day when projects go to all of those sources simultaneously. So you get the answers quickly. We require them to turn around the same amount of time. Literally, we are our own worst enemy by creating the bureaucracy of the complicated way that we heroically have tried to piece together funding where it didn't exist. But I think that private sector example is showing us how it can be done very quickly, sustainably, and for half the price.
No, thank you. And along those lines, I know in the city you've done a great job, but on the if you looked at the school districts, because I think in LAUSD, as big as it is, I think there's a lot of school properties that are underutilized and some that are vacant that, like you've done in terms of repurposing these old buildings and now turn them into housing. We maybe need to look at some of the schools that maybe need to be repurposed for affordable housing.
I agree 100%, and especially for that missing middle. We did that with a school district in a couple sites. teachers were paid too high to move in there. Some of the support staff in the school district, because we wanted to allow people who worked in those schools to be able to be right across the street from the school they worked in, they were able to afford it. But we have to figure out a way, some of it's a federal requirement, but we know that a teacher's income is not a middle class or luxury income in cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles. We should figure out ways for those rules to extend what those income requirements are, so we really can have affordable housing for folks like our teachers, hospitals, et cetera. But there's many property owners that are answering the call, Mr. Vasquez, including our churches, our faith community, that are finally taking those parking lots and other places that have been vacant for too long and saying, we want to be a part of the solution. You retain all your parking for your Sunday services, but you're able to, on the other 6 days a week, have affordable housing above that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, due to time, that limits our
Sure.
time on this topic. Oh, we do have one last and short and succinct question, right, Senator Gaines?
Yes, I'll keep
All
it
right.
really short. Number
Okay.
one, I just want to thank you for your service. I appreciate that as the mayor of one of the largest cities in the nation. But I did want you to know that we are working on speeding up the process for the welfare exemption. It's something that we're working on as a board over the last several months. We're trying to figure out how do we refine that and make that happen more quickly. And then
Super.
I think you also made a comment about really one-stop approval for permitting. Is that correct, for the regulatory approval?
I was talking more about for the funding, that you would be one stop between the different state funds, but with permitting as well, which is something we've done in Los Angeles. We physically located like 5 departments in one building, so you can go from one county to the next instead of waiting for months, and that's important.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. Thanks,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Wait, hold on. I have a soft heart. We've got one more. Mr. Schaefer.
Eric, Mike
Better be a
Schaefer.
good one, too.
Mike Schaefer here. You remember I ran for your district when you got to be mayor.
I remember. Good to see you behind there.
I've always been concerned about air pollution, and I think there's progress being made there. Like you couldn't build affordable housing down near the train station there because there was a pollution problem. And with the state getting cleaner air and cleaner cars and whatnot, there should be more and more locations open up for affordable housing. I assume you agree with me on that.
I do, and we've actually been putting things like our EV car shares around our affordable housing projects in our lowest income communities and communities of color first, so that folks who are transit dependent and don't even have cars can swipe out and take cars that are zero emissions, and we're putting the chargers right in front of those developments in the affordable housing projects that we are building. So it's a great way to tie those things together and literally making the air cleaner and the opportunities more abundant.
I so admire your leadership in Los Angeles. I read the Times every morning.
Thank you. Don't believe everything you read in the paper, but I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate it. Ms. Cicchetti, let's go to public comment.
Yes. AT&T moderator, please let us know if there's anyone on the line who'd like to make a public comment regarding this matter.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to comment, please press 1 then 0 on your telephone keypad. You may withdraw your comment at any time by repeating the 1-0 command. If you're using a speakerphone, please pick up the handset before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you wish to make a comment, please press 1 then 0 at this time. Madam Chair, we have no one queuing up at this time.
All right, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 12:52. We need to take a lunch break. We will be reconvening at, let's say, 1:35, and we will begin with our good friend, Mr. Richard Moon. Thank you. We are in recess.